Good day, everyone, and thank you very much for your time. I'm very excited to be discussing this topic, the use of internal orders in the area of CapEx management. I've been doing SAP for over 25 years, or 30 years. I've just calculated this today, so it's been a long time that we've been using internal orders to control CapEx projects, and I wonder why we still use them when we have project systems at hand. So let's just think a little bit about what is CapEx. We know that every organization requires to invest in its future, and that long-term investment of capital funds in infrastructure and technologies and geographic presence is essential for every organization to grow. CapEx is normally managed as a project, and within SAP, we have various methods of tracking CapEx. Now, CapEx projects are never easy. I think we've probably all been involved in capital investment projects. I guess most recently in our upgrade of SAP to S4HANA, or imminent upgrade of SAP to S4HANA. And we know that every capital project is subject to time and scope and schedule overruns. Now, every capital project is justified on the basis of its return on investment, and it's important that the cost invested to achieve that return is in line with expectations. Once every project starts, there's always a risk of scope variations that need to be tracked. There's always a lot of attention on capital projects. Everyone's keen for the new investment and the new technology in their area of operations. And all capital projects, by their nature, they're normally large and sometimes long in duration. They're subjected to external forces, whether those are tariffs or interest rate changes or exchange rate changes, or changes in the actions of your competitors. Things can require a re-evaluation of your capital project priorities at short notice. We're highly dependent in the delivery of capital projects, not only on our own internal resources, but increasingly on our suppliers and subcontractors. And of course, we need to maintain our capital project confidentiality because they are often very strategic in nature. So in order to deliver successful capital project outcomes, we really need an integrated approach that starts off with the identification, justification, evaluation, scoring, and prioritization of those candidate projects. So before we do anything in SAP, we need to think about what it is that we want to do, what's the priority for next year. We need to allocate our limited funding and resources towards the most important projects. They're going to make the biggest difference, or the most urgent to the organization next year. We want to then make sure that all the right stakeholders are involved in the decision-making process, and we gain the appropriate approvals. We know how long and frustrating that can be. We all wait anxiously for that CapEx approval to come through. Once it is, we need to track those costs in a place in SAP where we can see what it is that we budgeted, what it is that we've spent so far, what it is that we've committed to spend through purchase orders we've raised on our suppliers, and any other forecast expenditure to come, so we can provide the organization with clarity of when that money is going to be spent and when the benefits are going to be received. And at the end of the CapEx project, we need to consolidate all those costs and move them into fixed assets on the balance sheet. So if we think about how we control CapEx projects in SAP today, I'm amazed how many of us are still relying on internal orders to control large-scale capital projects. We have many customers spending many billions of dollars annually that still rely extensively on internal orders to track that capital expenditure. So just for everyone's recollection and familiarity, internal orders have been around since I started in SAP in the 90s, and they're a temporary cost collector similar to internal orders. They can collect costs, but importantly, those costs can then be tracked independently from the cost, the business as usual cost center costs, and they can be periodically capitalized as capital work in progress at the end of each month, and ultimately those costs can be transferred from the internal order to the fixed assets. So they really are a useful, what SAP would call, investment measure mechanism within SAP for tracking simple projects. Yeah. So if you're just going to buy a new forklift for the warehouse, an internal order is probably more than sufficient to allocate a budget to record the commitments and receive the actual costs and any on costs, and then transfer those costs from the order once it's all collected to your final fixed asset master record. The other method of tracking CapEx costs in SAP is to use the project systems. So the project systems, was designed to manage projects, extensively used, in particular industries, oil and gas for one. Project systems can be used for own-built projects. There's extensive functionality in there to fully define the scope of your project, the work breakdown structure, the network of activities that is related to the delivery of that project, for scheduling internal and external inputs to the project, to have an idea of your resource assignments and your scheduling of the project. Now, project systems, is much more sophisticated, and whilst in nature at a high level, a WBS element is very similar to an internal order. As the screenshot shows, there's a lot more functionality accessible to project systems, and it's really a reason why in the initial implementations a lot of organizations steer a little bit clear of Microsoft projects. But what's common about them, and very relevant to the use case of capital project control, is that both WBS elements and internal orders have the ability to track statuses. So with every project, we know it goes through a project life cycle. It's contemplated, it's desired, it's budgeted, it's released, it's executed, and at some point, hopefully on schedule, it's technically completed and ultimately closed down, and the costs transferred from the investment measure to the final fixed asset or assets. So it's a critical component of functionality, the status management. We know that we have ability to budget and plan both internal orders and project WBS elements. And that's crucial. We need to be able to track our costs against those plans and budgets. It's interesting that with S/4HANA migrations, there's perhaps less of a need to do the planning and budgeting directly within SAP, and more of that the planning and budgeting analysis is being done in the SAP Analytics Cloud. But still, it's useful having that budget, particularly sitting in SAP, because it can form a basis for your budget availability check. Dynamically, as you're raising purchase orders, you can see the budget that is available to you. And ultimately, both objects support the distribution of the final costs to those target assets periodically, through the life cycle of the project. If we're ready to capitalize some components, or right at the end, we can do our cost split by the various assets that were produced. So there are similarities, but the question is, if we are running large capital projects, why don't we use internal orders for the easy ones and use projects for the more complicated ones? And I think it comes down to really three things. The perceived simplicity of internal orders. It's kind of one object, we understand it, the master data is simple. When the process is such that our legacy CapEx request form, which still for lots of organizations, is in SharePoint or an Excel spreadsheet or DocuSign or PDF document that gets emailed around. Once that CapEx request is approved, it's easier for us to manually create internal orders in SAP. So maybe that was the reason we chose internal orders. And frankly, when a lot of us first implemented our SAP systems, there wasn't a lot of expertise in project systems. It looked like another whole module, another whole consultant, another huge cost to bear. So really, the consultants themselves were probably saying, look, internal orders are probably good enough for 80% of your projects. The 20% where they're probably not ideal will probably work around the constraints of the internal orders. And we'll just be consistent and use internal orders for everything, and let's get the project done. And we've left with, some supporting our bigger projects through the use of a very simple investment measure object in SAP called an internal order. Unfortunately, projects, particularly CapEx projects, are never straightforward. Yeah, every project by its nature requires estimation and forecasting, planning in an area of uncertainty. It's hard enough predicting what things are going to cost today. It's even harder when you're trying to estimate, for next year. We're always asked to put in our budget for the projects way in advance of actually executing them. So we've got difficulty in estimating, in an uncertain environment. So we need to, maintain some degree of flexibility in how we plan and budget our project costs, and we need to know where and how we've estimated that project cost. And if we only have one thing in SAP for the whole project cost, it's hard to know, whether that was what we'd set aside, for the foundations or the walls or the roof, of our project. So, we are limited with a single internal order. As we, gain approvals for our projects, we almost certainly know that we might have to go back to the well and get some more money, particularly in IT projects. And there's one thing tracking just that supplementary budget allocation as a delta, but really what was it for? So if we've, is it for the same scope or is it for something slightly more? If you have a project, in SAP, for example, you might choose to incorporate that, additional scope as another WBS element within your project. So we can clearly see not only was there a budget supplement overall, but where that budget was allocated to that particular, phase 2 or additional feature to our project deliverable. We're talking about CapEx today. Obviously, internal orders are also used for pure OpEx, OpEx expenditure. But we also have the case, ordinarily I'd say have the case where any project has a component of CapEx and a component of OpEx, and we need to find ways of neatly, separating those two cost components. The CapEx components we need to capitalize on a periodic basis as an asset under construction and settle finally to the balance sheet. Whereas the OpEx components of our projects, maybe some preliminary investigations and design work or legal work or training activities, they are part of the overall investment. So we want to know how much it's going to cost us together. But those OpEx costs end up, in the responsible cost center as and when they're occurred. Yeah. So the accounting treatment of these CapEx and OpEx items is different, and we need to, have a way in SAP of, both isolating the two cost flows as well as combining them for overall investment management. With the use of WBSs, for example, it's quite common practice that we can have a dedicated WBS element for the CapEx items of a project, another WBS element for the OpEx items, and using that method, we're able to distinguish the cost flows and the accounting treatment appropriately. With internal orders, that split is a bit harder to achieve. With CapEx projects, they run for a while, and we need to provide good monthly reporting, not only of the actual costs to date, but of the when the future costs are going to come. One of the biggest challenges with CapEx is often that they run behind, so we're underspending on a monthly basis, and we need to just factor that in to our calculations. If we knew that, there's things we could do differently. We could bring some projects forward. So we need to get forecasts by month, and we need to be able to compare our actuals and forecasts, to our budget by month. Unfortunately, within SAP, budgeting is an annual concept. Yeah. So we don't have a budget by month in SAP, so it's hard to track those monthly variations against our budgeted spend. So this is one reason why people move their budget versus actual comparison out of SAP and do it in SAP Analytics Cloud or Excel, or they use planning functionality in SAP, which is a monthly concept, as the way of tracking their budget, which is a little bit confusing again to our end users, because they now need in SAP we have these two things. We have a plan and we have a budget. And often what we call in the business the budget might actually be represented by what we call the plan in SAP. So that's a challenge with project control. As I say, with large projects, there's often more than one asset that gets created as a result. And I want to capitalize the building and the equipment separately. That comes out of a new plant development, for example. So you want to know the overall costs. So you want to combine all those costs together, to control against the budget. But at the end of the day, you need to separate those costs out and know how much was for the building and how much was for equipment A and equipment B. With the Project WBS structure, you're able to track those various asset cost components independently, and that makes the asset capitalization at the end of the day a lot easier, because all your related asset costs are in one WBS element. What we find is when we lump all our costs into one internal order, we have a problem at the end of the project, to separate out those assets splits, and that's another whole Excel spreadsheet and process involved, with defining the settlement rules out of the capital project. Again, based on this concept of uncertainty and providing a little bit more for unanticipated costs, we have a management reserve or contingency that normally gets approved as part of the initial request. And where does that go? If we allocate that whole amount to the to the internal order, for sure we'll spend it. And if we don't put it there, then where is it? Do we introduce investment management and have it on some investment program and distribute it proportionally, or do we keep it in an Excel spreadsheet? One of the interesting capabilities of projects, for example, is that you can have the budget allocated to the top level of the project, but then cascade only proportionately down to the individual WBS elements. So somebody responsible for one aspect of that whole project delivery, one WBS element of the total project, might only receive their proportionate distribution of budget, and they manage to that target level, knowing that we have still some budget capacity at hand that we can release when required. Many of us don't execute projects completely internally. We rely extensively on our suppliers and subcontractors to perform the work for us. Often there are multiple third parties involved in a project delivery, and it's very beneficial to be able to track individual supplier performance and costings. If we only have one internal order, it's very hard to track the costs of our various partners. Where if we had more of a work breakdown structure within the project, it's easier to allocate and track each supplier's performance accordingly. Projects are daunting, they are complex in SAP, but projects are daunting and complex, and there is a lot of justification and classification required to understand the nature of our major capital projects, and to be able to produce meaningful analyses of our project costs. So both internal orders and projects have the concept of user fields and user statuses and text fields. Projects have more, and sometimes those additional justifications and classifications are really required to get a full appreciation of what we're doing. And the document management system, is much more sophisticated within the projects module, as is necessary for any significant project. We have all the designs and specifications and contractual arrangements and details behind the project delivery that need to be referred to from time to time, particularly when things go wrong. So really keeping control of that supporting documentation and knowing where it is and what version we're running to is critically important. Okay, so projects are complex, and I think we can all agree that ideally it would be lovely to have the power of projects for particularly our larger capital investment control within SAP. And the fundamental things just to bear in mind is this concept of the work breakdown structure. So as you can see there, in projects, you can define the various elements that go into successful project delivery, and the range of options we have to track those WBS elements or internal and external network of activities related to the delivery, and be clear that the project capability to do this top-down budget distribution is very beneficial to track the overall project costs, as well as individual areas of responsibilities, or supplier cost component or particular asset breakdown budget allocations. So if we are stuck with internal orders, and we're not planning using our S/4HANA migration as a way of maybe reconsidering that approach, SAP would certainly like you to. SAP's intended almost not to bring internal orders across to S/4HANA until there was a community outcry. So if you are thinking about a change in your migration, it might be a time to consider adoption of simple projects in S/4HANA, and leave internal orders behind, or leave them for very limited use cases. But if we're under pressure and internal orders are part of our go forward strategy, what have we seen customers do to work around the constraints of internal orders? And none of these are very great, by the way, but what we're seeing customer doing is trying to mimic a WBS kind of structure with external numbering conventions to their internal orders. So if a project has got 3 cost components to it, we'll create 3 internal orders and use some kind of external numbering scheme to gather them up together, make them look like they're related. But external numbering schemes, as we know, for those of us who've been in SAP a long time, can be hard to sustain, right? We often see customers putting in, for example, the budget year into an internal order number, and as soon as then that project gets scheduled or rescheduled to next year, suddenly that number doesn't work anymore, and it's very difficult to change, or let's say it's impossible to change the number of an internal order once it's assigned, right? So we don't really like putting in logic into our internal audit numbers. And by the way, that's a key feature of projects. Yeah, is you're able to change your project numbering much more flexibly, because internally within SAP, there's a conversion of your kind of coding mask WBS number to the internal project ID. Another method customers have used is order groups. You try and maintain order groups that link all these orders together for a project and report accordingly. You still have a problem with that budget distribution or your contingency reserve. Where is that held? So sometimes there's another order in that order group just to hold things like contingency or shared costs. So those order groups become hard to administer as well. Had an interesting implementation from one customer that used a investment program position from IM as the overall project cost control, and then all the related internal orders related to that investment management position. That also is complex to sustain, particularly manually, particularly as you roll forward from year to year. You now have a lot of investment program positions that no longer apply, and there's a lot of tidy up of your investment program that's required year on year. And a lot of manual processing if you're doing it manually to sustain that architecture. But I guess the main workaround that we see is spreadsheets, yeah. And if you mention CapEx, you immediately think in most organizations of a lot of spreadsheets. There's capital, budgeting wish list spreadsheets that are sent out, and there's capital budgeting forecast spreadsheets, and there's capital reporting spreadsheets, there's capital business case justification spreadsheets. So it's a world of spreadsheets. When I started in SAP, 95, the goal was to eliminate spreadsheets. And yet today in 2025, I would say everyone on the call probably uses spreadsheets extensively in the support of their CapEx process. And really, is that right? Yeah, given all the technology we have at our hand, why are we still using spreadsheets so extensively to control this absolutely mission critical business process? Someone has made a note, Cindy. I'll just respond to that. It's a good one. It's asked a question, would we use internal orders and WBSs, or would we make the shift? I think that's kind of the ideal scenario, right? Is to be able to use both orders and projects. Use orders for the simple ones, use projects for the complex ones. If only we could do it in a way that was easy, yeah? Easy for us to administer, easy for the users, limited confusion, didn't require extra effort. The problem is really that user experience. If we think about it, we don't want end users going into the system and creating projects, right? They'll always get it wrong. There's just too much master data for the average end user to get it right. I mean, they won't even get creating internal order right, to be frank. Often that administration of the master data is done by a central person on the back of a spreadsheet, because get it wrong, like with all SAP master data, and all kinds of bad things happen. Yeah. So we have a problem with usability of either orders or projects in SAP, and we have a problem with spreadsheets. So really, I think our challenge, if we're trying to manage CapEx as a business process, and we've only got internal orders and projects, how do we kind of close that gap of usability, efficiency, timeliness? We always want our project objects, whether they're orders or projects, to be created quickly, because it's taken a long time for them to get approved, and our team is ready to run, and the supplier is nagging us. So timing is important here, and we want ongoing effectiveness, right, of whatever we choose, not only for the planning and the budgeting, but for the cost control and forecasting, and for the final project completion by element, and capitalization. So we need to think of the end-to-end process when we make these decisions, and not just the the actuals as they're incurred on a monthly basis. So how do we kind of close this gap? And I guess that's been our mission. So that's, as an organization, that's kind of all we do. So if you go to our website, you'll say we just do CapEx solutions for SAP. because it's big enough of a challenge, and it's important enough for our customers. When their future strategic success depends on where they spend CapEx today, this is an area that requires some, severe focus. And really, our approach is very SAP centric. So at the end of the day, we want to use what's available in SAP in the right way. So we want to use both projects and internal orders, either or, and ideally both, because they're both valuable. So it's our going in assumption that at the end of the day, your actual costs and commitments are tracked in SAP against probably both internal orders and projects as applicable. But we want to make the user experience of the SAP implementation as user-friendly as possible. And whether you're on S4 today or on the way to S4, many of our customers are not yet on S4, and we still are able to provide the Fiori app experience on top of the S4 transactions. And really, the Fiori app experience is about bringing the functionality that's under the hood in SAP to project managers and executives in a much more tailored and user-friendly way, right? And that means simplifying it, the user experience, and automating as much as possible of the business logic behind the scenes, so that the users don't have to remember, which buttons to click, which selections to make. You can surface only the critical attributes that the particular user knows and understands, and orchestrate as much as possible the updates to SAP in a consistent way. So as opposed to creating an internal order and then going to KO 30 to maintain the budget and KO 40 to maintain the plan, back into the project to release the status, we have one app that will kind of orchestrate all those back-end transactions for you. And particularly what we do with these apps is make sure that they're process-centric, right? So we get all the right people putting in all the right information in the right order, and we agree on the work package, and then once we all agree, then we'll go off and automate all the SAP transaction updates as patterns. So workflow is heavily built into all our Fiori apps. But what about users that are not SAP familiar? They're just engineers or anyone who has an idea, who wants to put in a CapEx request, from a laptop, to an acquisition, to some AI compute infrastructure. How do we bring the CapEx process to the very edge? And for that, we've got a SaaS plugin, which we call Stratex Online, which is all about the ideation, planning, business case preparation, the spreadsheet elimination, let's say, for the portfolio management. Of course, SAP has SAP PPM module available. It has the investment module available with appropriation requests and the like, and that's a viable strategy. But there's still a cost, and a usability gap with those SAP solutions, and we think we're, with our own ready-to-run SaaS plugin for SAP, it's much quicker implementation and frankly a lot more cost-effective and flexible. So just having a quick look at those two solutions for your information. What is Stratex Online? It's a single source of truth for capital budgeting. It is your spreadsheet replacement. It's your multiple spreadsheets replacement. It's your planning spreadsheets. It's your budgeting, allocations. It's your business case preparation. It's your reporting spreadsheets. So it's a lot of spreadsheet replaced here. It's a single flow, so you can track all the way through from early stage ideation through the various stages of a project planning, all the way through to project execution in SAP. By having all the business cases in the one tool, and by that we mean the financial analysis, your net present value calculations, your payback calculations, really doing your estimating of both costs and benefits, we can ensure we have consistent calculations on common assumptions around exchange rates and discount rates, internal labor rates, etc. And we're able to apply qualitative scoring on top of that around risks or confidence or strategic alignment. So really the idea is to have a reliable and effective basis for decision making, for ultimately ranking your projects and picking the projects that matter most, and having all projects in the system at all stages with consistent scoring and ranking allows us to analyze both costs and forecast costs, but also forecast benefits. Today we have good control of our costs of our capital projects in our internal orders or projects, but we don't really know what we planned as benefits coming out of those projects. We don't really know what we planned on saving, what we planned on revenue production as a result of those investments, because their planning information for many of us is outside of the system. So Stratex will have all that data, right? It will know for every project what the expected impact will be to your future depreciation, to your future revenue, to your future labor costs, and you're able to factor that into your overall planning processes from a reliable single source without having to go through all the spreadsheets. Stratex handles a lot of that workflow, right? So let's get rid of the SharePoint, let's get rid of the email, let's get rid of the DocuSigns. Let's have one way of approving CapEx from the budgeting cycle through to the expenditure cycle. And I think most importantly, particularly in today's environment where it's so hard to predict 18 months ahead, never mind next quarter, how do we make our planning and prioritization framework agile enough that we can reprioritize, when we're subjected to additional tariffs or changes in the price of our inputs or sales. We've got a lot of gold miners right now who are delighted by the gold price, and suddenly a lot more projects become viable as a result of a change in the commodity price, which they couldn't control, they didn't know, but now that they do, the picture changes, and you need to be able to adjust your projects portfolio in light of environmental conditions efficiently and effectively. All right, so just briefly, what does it look like? So Stratex is a SaaS solution, as I say. It's plugged in, it's ready to run. You've got all your projects in one database with all its costs and scoring. Individual projects you can drill down on. I've got some of these scoring metrics about benefits and confidence and strategic alignment and KPIs, financial KPIs like internal rate of return or payback period, and all the descriptions and all the supporting documents and all the linkages and all the commentary, and all the planned, budget approved and supplement forecasted costs and classification. So a very flexible tool to replace your spreadsheets. That's all this is. Just a bit more look at the Fiori apps. So the Fiori apps, are available, I must stress this, for ECC and S4HANA. So you do not need to be on S4HANA to make use of Fiori. And a lot of organizations are using their the Fiori apps for CapEx as really a way of generating executive interest in their S4HANA upgrade, because they get a taste a little bit of what Fiori might mean for their organization in terms of usability and seeing SAP in a different light. So many of our customers, their first Fiori app they ever used was the CapEx form as a Fiori app. Many of our customers are using investment management in SAP, and our Fiori apps support that. So a better way of maintaining your investment program, for updating your budgets on your investment program through the annual planning exercise, for distributing budget from your investment program down into your investment measures, creating that investment measures. So you can definitely use IM with our Fiori apps, but increasingly organizations are electing not to use IM, and we're just linking the capital planning that was done within IM with Stratex, and then using the Fiori apps to manage the detail of the execution within SAP, the project creation and project completion activities and procurement activities within SAP. So with the Fiori apps, we can handle all master data changes in a user-friendly, process-oriented way. So whether those are the projects or the orders or the vendors or the fixed assets themselves, every capital replacement project, also requires an asset disposal form, and an activity. So we can handle all of the asset-related transactions too. Once you've got the master data, all the business processes around that, around the requisitions, ordering, receipting, make it easier to do your service entry sheets by project managers through a Fiori app. Be able to, with all of these, whether it's a master data request or a transaction request, have the workflow, in Fiori going to all the responsible people before the transactions are created. And then using the Fiori apps, of course, to provide user-friendly analytics to the project managers themselves about how their projects are going versus their plans and budgets and forecasts and commitments, etc. So just to re-emphasize, the Fiori apps are ready to run, so we deploy them to your environment, but they come with a we call it App Builder. It's an SAP certified add-on component, which is a low-code environment, which lets you easily add and remove relevant attributes to the forms. In that need for simplification. If you don't use business areas, you don't want to see that field, so you take it away. If you do, you do want to see it, and it's mandatory, or maybe it can be derived. So you can apply your own business rules to the fields you see on the screen, including both SAP fields and non-SAP, just pure documentation fields that are necessary for the workflow and approval. So really aim at that simplified user experience. The Fiori apps have got a built-in workflow engine. You can use SAP workflow as well, plug those in behind the scenes. But we've got a native workflow engine behind all our Fiori apps, which make it really easy to adjust through a kind of an approval matrix, right, where you can specify value limits, for example, or classifications as to who needs to look at what projects. So every IT project, for example, might go to the IT manager. Every project over $1 million might go to the CFO. So you can set up those rules easily. And then the key point, whilst SAP standard Fiori apps and our Fiori apps, look identical to the SAP ones, they're all on the launchpad and they operate similarly to the end users. But what's kind of unique about our Fiori apps is they really are CapEx aware, and they understand that one thing, like a CapEx approval form, will generate multiple SAP transaction updates. You're creating the projects and the budgets and the statuses. One form, like the project completion request, will create the assets. It'll do the status management. It will do the transfers and settlements. So there's, once we all agree what the project closure, looks like, that it is closed, everyone's happy with what's done, what the asset splits are, the system can then orchestrate all those transactions so somebody doesn't have to go and remember and accurately process those transactions manually in the back end. It can all be handled via the Fiori apps. All right, so I think that we need to consider our go forward selection of internal orders versus project systems in the context of why this is such a business critical process, why we need to do something here, why we should use potential S4 transition as a time to have a closer look at CapEx digitalization. Can we do it better? In the future, can we eliminate some of those spreadsheets, and why is that of interest to organizations? Why would we consider a revisiting of the CapEx process now? Well, because now CapEx is even harder to access, and it's even more critical. It's a highly competitive world, and if we don't spend money in the right places, we're going to be left behind. So we don't want to be left behind, but we don't want to waste money. So the first benefit of CapEx digitalization is make sure we're as efficient as possible. Right? If we're spending, time manipulating spreadsheets, we're wasting valuable resources. They could be reapplying their intellect and attention to picking the right projects rather than to, copying and pasting between spreadsheets to produce reports, right? So the first benefit of replacing spreadsheets with kind of a seamless flow is efficiency. productivity of your team. And the benefit of linking closely your plans and your actuals, and having a monthly view of your budgets and spend, and your forecast spend, and what the real picture looks like, is that we can make faster decisions around stopping projects that are going nowhere and are going to cost us more and are less critical, and redeploying the time and money on better projects. Too often we fail to stop projects that we know are going to end in disaster and just end up wasting money that go, in the worst case, that don't even go live, or do go live, but much later than necessary, for much more than planned, and without a valid business case anymore, because the costs exceed the future benefits. So we can save a lot of money with CapEx digitalization. We can also really make more money, just because the project came in on budget and scope, and all looks good from a technical point of view. Was it the right project? Did we get the right mix? So being able to consistently, and I guess from our point of view, fairly and transparently pick and approve and select and dynamically reallocate funds and resources as circumstances change to the optimal project portfolio is really going to drive long-term strategic success. So it's very hard to be agile and flexible with slow and manual and cumbersome systems. So digitalization of the process will give you that speed and flexibility that you need to outcompete. And I guess the third benefit is vitally important, is risk mitigation. So SAP is good at tracking the budget and the actual costs. Where are we tracking our risks, and in our inherent risks in our selection, or ongoing risks, our sensitivity of our business cases to changing environmental factors. How good are we at tracking compliance of the approval process, and getting the right people involved in the technical evaluation and commercial evaluation of our project definitions and our supplier selection, to make sure we are going to pick the projects that have a high return, but are also within manageable kind of risk profiles, and ensure our confidentiality of these projects all the way through. So even though you've got a single source of truth that replaces the spreadsheets, doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has access to everything. It's all the right people have access to everything they need to see and participate in at the right time. And we really want an environment that gives us that timely, reliable analytics to mitigate risk when things get out of order. So you can only know that you're out of sync with the plans and expectations if you can closely align your plans and your budgets with your actuals, and commitments and forecasts. And if that's reliant, on manual extractions and compilations, it might be too late, to make timely changes. So thank you very much for your time today. Hopefully that was of some interest and give you some thoughts. If you would like to have a look at any of those solutions, whether it's the Fiori apps to drive SAP transactions, or some of that front-end planning with Stratex Online, we'd be delighted to touch base and run you through some customer case studies. We can you can pilot and trial some of that stuff yourself and have a look at the fit in your environment. So we have a few minutes left. I'll take some questions. So please use the Q&A message bar down below to put through your questions. I see we've got a couple coming through here. So is Stratex fully integrated with SAP EPPM and other modules like AA and FICO? Yes. So to clarify, the Stratex is the planning tool. So it's self-sufficient to a degree. You don't need SAP at all. So we have customers using Stratex that don't have SAP as a backend. So it was designed for large organizations that have SAP in many business units or divisions, but maybe not SAP everywhere, and they have SAP licenses for most of the people, but not for all of their people. So Stratex really is aimed at bridging that licensing and back-end gap. And it has a full suite of APIs, that can integrate into all modules, like EPPM for sure, and other areas, other procurement systems, for example. So it's API enabled. In terms of the Fiori apps, that's what we typically use for the detailed SAP transactional processing. Yeah. So if it comes to asset transfers or disposals, revaluations, so anything to do with assets, we use the Fiori apps for that project completion. So for any other procurement or service entry sheets and vendor creation and onboarding, we use the Fiori apps that's closer to the SAP functionality. Isram is asking, how can I give a demo? Yeah, I'd love to give you a demo. So please reach out and we can do a full demo of Stratex in integration with SAP. So the flow is generally the idea starts in Stratex. That gets developed into an investment proposal in Stratex. That goes into the budgeting cycle in Stratex. A budget is approved. The business case is then created with all its financial analysis, and that gets approved. And it's really only on the business case approval that the integration to SAP normally occurs to create the projects or internal orders in SAP. That can be a straight through process, but typically we stage it. So once it's approved in Stratex, it'll go into kind of the Fiori app environment where the current administrators of the master data can view the data coming in, make any further data supplementations or adjustments as required for your particular configuration. Let's say you've got a manual numbering range that you want to apply some manual logic to, you could do that, or do some additional classification. So there's an opportunity to validate the data coming through and then click the button, and that can then have another workflow within SAP, or just directly create the SAP transactions within SAP. So that's the flow, Stratex to Fiori to SAP, and then we have a set of tools that will bring the data back from SAP into Stratex to keep track of your actuals and commitments. So it's a seamless interflow, and that's the tool is available on the SAP store, so you can go in there as well. It's certified on there and acquire. Do you need to be on S/4HANA to use Stratex? No, indeed not. So as I mentioned, Stratex is a SaaS. It's ready to run. A very simple licensing model. So it's extremely cost effective in the context of SAP products, and it's not user based. Yeah, so it's really scalable without any SAP licensing constraints, which is very important. So we have customers who just use the Fiori apps, let's say for the CapEx forms, but one of the risks there is everyone needs to be on have an SAP license effectively and be on SAP to be able to use the kind of the Fiori apps. So having that SaaS front end at the very front end of the process eliminates the SAP and licensing dependency. Pamela's asking, do you leverage this tool for creating budget books / annual budget? Absolutely. So that's the purpose of the tool. It's to gather up all the project demand and then put it into one place and then score it consistently, transparently, and pick, I guess, the most valuable projects that will go into the budget, the first cut of the budget, right? And then if things change, environment changes, or the suppliers aren't available, or the projects get delayed, then you have the ability to to kind of make substitutions or reprioritize those projects going in. So you've always got kind of this backlog of projects that are going through this funnel, getting actively reprioritized in accordance with kind of a top-down budget constraint that you might have to keep getting the most. The idea is to keep getting the most value from your CapEx investment in the kind of the Stratex online planning tool. And then as those projects are ready for execution, it transitions across to create the internal orders or projects in SAP with the correct allocated budget, annual budget, and the correct allocated monthly plan, right? So we would typically, because it's automatic and because no one's doing it manually, have both budgets and plans, reflected in SAP. And then those budgets and plans, of course, can roll up into your SAP Analytics Cloud, and other EPM tools for performance management. We're really most concerned about your capital budget, getting the right projects into the budget, and having control of those projects, effective control of those projects using SAP functionality to its fullest without the complexity of people having to go in and maintain that master data.